Hey guys, I am going to watch a video proving triangle congruence using two-column proof. So let's do it.
Okay, so here's a proof that I was going to have you do while I was absent. So I'm going to make this video so that you can check your work after you have attempted it. So we're going to write a two-column proof, and we're given that angle NKL is congruent to angle NJM, and that KL is congruent to JM, and we want to prove that segment LN is congruent to segment MN, okay? So the first thing we always do in a proof, I told you every time, is you're going to write down the givens. So the first given is angle NKL is congruent to angle NJM. And that's a given. And then remember I told you when you have two givens, you can just put the second given right under the first and you don't need to name it as a new step. So then segment KL is congruent to segment JM. Good. So I also taught you that you should mark it off when you know something's congruent to something else. So angle NKL is congruent to angle NJM. So let's look at this. NKL. So that's this angle right here. And that's congruent to angle NJM. So NJM, so this one right here. Good. Now we also know that KL, segment KL is congruent to segment JM. So this is KL, this is JM. Remember I told you sometimes it's hard if you put a hash mark there because then you might say, well, is it this segment or is it this segment or is it the whole thing? So I had suggested that you use another color. So let's use, well actually we could still use orange. So we're going to use this orange marker to denote that these two have the same measure because we don't want to put a hash mark on and confuse ourselves, okay? So if we're trying to prove that two segments are congruent, let's look at what those two segments are. LN and MN. That's going to be interesting. So it looks to me like LN would be a side of this triangle, LKN. And it looks like MN would be a side of this triangle, MJN. So if we could prove the two triangles congruent, we could then use that fun thing called CPCTC to prove that those two segments are congruent. So let's focus on trying to get those two triangles congruent. So right now I've got angles and a side. So I either need another side or I need another angle. And this is something that's interesting. This angle right down here, this angle N, it looks like it's in both triangles. It looks like, you know, if we think about this, MJN, look at this, MJN, that's angle N, and then LKN, and that's angle N. So I'm thinking that my next step should probably be that angle N is congruent to itself, so I can use it in both triangles. So that's the reflexive property. So now I have that this angle is congruent to itself, and it's in both triangles. It's in both triangles. Now, if you're having trouble seeing this and you're like, oh my goodness, the triangles are together, this is so confusing, split them apart. Just split them apart. Redraw them right down here. So let's redraw them right down here. So we've got triangle, let's see, JMN. Okay, I pulled this off and kind of tilted it down. And let me pull this off and kind of tilt it down this way. So we've got triangle, now that I've pulled that off, I've got LKN. Okay? So let's look at what we had marked off. We had J and K. Good. And we've got, what, two sides? So JM, good, is congruent to KL. Good. And then we made that comment about angle N being congruent to itself. So you see how angle N is in both? So the other thing I would have to tell you is if you can't see that they've got a shared angle. Remember before I talked about that shared side? I'm like, oh, if you really feel like you're stuck, look for that shared side. Same thing goes with shared angles. Sometimes they share an angle, so you want to look for that if you feel like you're stuck, because this didn't really help us with anything, that didn't really help us with anything. Remember we talked about parallel lines can help you find alternate interior angles. knowing that something's the midpoint of a segment can help you know that two segments are congruent. But here, this kind of led us to nowhere, so we had to look for something else. And I said, whenever you get stuck, look for two things, vertical angles or shared sides. Well, we're now going to add to that, and we're going to say, also look for shared angles. So shared sides, shared angles, and vertical angles are going to be where you're going to go if you feel stuck. Now look at these two triangles right now. J and M and K and L, they're congruent by angle, angle, side, right? Angle, angle, side. Remember I said trace it around. This is not angle, side, angle. This is angle, angle, side because you trace around the triangle. So you go to an angle, to another angle, and then to a side. You go from an angle to another angle and then to a side. Okay, so let's write that. Oops, we're on step 3, not step 2. Okay, so for this one, we're going to say that triangle KNL is congruent to triangle JNM. And the reason for that is angle, angle, side. Good. Now that we know those two triangles are congruent, what do we know about their corresponding parts? They're congruent as well, okay? So we can now prove what we're trying to prove, which is that LN is congruent to MN. And the reason for that is CPCTC. Because if you think about it, we wanted to prove that LN was congruent to MN, okay? So we can see right here that they are because these triangles are congruent, which means that those two sides are congruent, these two sides are congruent, this final angle is congruent to that final angle, okay? So I think that's something for you to understand is that when you're trying to prove two segments congruent or you're trying to prove two angles congruent, quite often what you want to do is you want to prove the triangles congruent first, and then you want to prove that the segments are congruent or the angles are congruent by CPCTC. So this is a very common final two steps. Do whatever you got to do up here, prove the triangles congruent, and then that final step is to prove the two segments are congruent or the two angles are congruent. So remember that in your proofs. When I give you another proof and you say, oh, I'm trying to prove two triangles congruent, perfect. Go through your normal thing, prove the two triangles congruent. But if I ever say you're trying to prove two segments congruent, most likely what you're going to have to do is prove the triangles congruent and then prove by CPCTC that the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, aka, in this case, the two segments are congruent. Okay? Very good.
I learned many things from this video on how to prove triangle congruence using two-column proof. And she said if you're stuck, you must find shared angles. She said that. And if your triangles are congruent, then you must prove that segments must be congruent. Then you can use the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, or CPCTC. And that's all. Thank you for the video because I learned a lot from this video. So